Hey,
We are live
we are live. I've noticed that.
again.
Here we go again.
Calling Chris Anderson in London town.
London.
How you doing?
This is Chris Anderson in London town and calling Rick Beyer from I don't know where. That looks different.
I am in Charles City, Iowa. I'm giving
Okay.
Iowa a try today.
Yeah, you get around.
Well, I'm here. I'm actually tomorrow going to be speaking about the Ghost Army. Here's
Yeah.
to that. At the Nashua Plainfield School, where you remember Caleb Sinwell, who was on History Happy Hour.
Yes.
That's his school, and so I would think they'd know all about the Ghost Army already. Maybe they do, and they'll be really bored with what I have to say. But they'll like the inflatable tank, so that's the important thing. That's the important
What's
thing.
not to love about an inflatable tank?
What's not to love about an inflatable tank? Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I travel the globe from London to Charles City, Iowa. But we still managed to be here Sundays having a cocktail and talking about history. And today we'll be talking about a World War I hotspot, the Argonne Forest. And Chris, who's around? Who's out there in our audience today?
Well, so far, Paul Sawyer is joining us. Doreen, again. Ted from our nation's capital. The Templins, who are Patreon subscribers, which we appreciate. Tony Coulter. John Gallagher from Kentucky. All sorts of folks.
I see Chris Jackson, also from Iowa. Yeah, Chris, I'm close to you. I'm as close to you as I've been in a long time. And Tony and Ann and Bill and other people signing in, and Skip from Delaware, Ohio. I'm going to the state of Delaware, but that's probably not anywhere near Delaware, Ohio. Well, we're really happy that all you guys have joined us today.
Absolutely.
And yeah, Chris, I think we've probably killed enough time. Maybe we can
yeah.
actually get the show started. What do you think?
Sounds good. All right. Wow, and he brings the bell.
Rings the bell. The bar
Bar
is open. What's on tap today?
Well, as you may have picked up on so far, we're going to be going to the trenches in World War One, and our guest this week is Richard Merry. And Richard has had a lifelong interest in the First World War, and his particular interest in the Argonne was sparked when he inherited a box of letters. And it became so much of an interest that he now owns a house there, acts as a battlefield guide, volunteer guide in the Meuse Argonne, and when he's not there, he's living in London, where he writes for a variety of historical publications and speaks on the Meuse Argonne. And we're here to talk about his book, which is on that topic, The Great War in the Argonne Forest. So, Richard,
Welcome.
Yeah, good evening. Nice to see you.
Great. So I'll just start right off, Richard. It's fair to say that Americans, those that do know about the Meuse Argonne, kind of consider it our battle. So how is it that an English person like yourself became involved in this part of the Western Front? I know I live here in London, and most British people I know, it's all about the Somme and Ypres and Arras, and you say Meuse Argonne, and they kind of look at you funny. So what brought you to this subject?
Well, it's a long, as you said earlier, I inherited a shoebox full of letters and correspondence from my father's uncle. And my father said to me, I was a bit of a rum sort of fellow, and he died before the First World War. And I just put the box away. And then round about 2000, I was starting to do family history on ancestry.com. And because my great uncle was a classic English Victorian middle class person, a lot of records, he was on the censuses. He became quite easy to flesh out. But then as I delved deeper into him, it became more than apparent that actually he hadn't died at all before the First World War. And so there he is here. This is just after he joined up. So what in fact he was a car salesman for a French sports car company called Moores. And in the summer of 1914, tens of thousands of people from America, from all over the world, were flocking to France to fight for France's cause in the First World War. And what happened was France wasn't particularly keen to take in lots of foreigners, because this is the period, you have to remember, when everyone was saying the war will be over by Christmas. So what France decided to do was to enlarge the French Foreign Legion, because they were very concerned that something like 60% of the French Foreign Legion at the outset of the war were Germans and Austrians, and they weren't quite clear which side they might end up on. And as France still had quite a substantial sort of African empire, what they decided to do was to leave the Austrians and the Germans looking after the Beaugest forts in Africa, and they would bring over a lot of experienced officers and NCOs, and they would give birth to another foreign legion with all the foreigners that were pouring into France to join up for the fight. Now, my great uncle, naturally, one would assume, although he'd been living in France at this point for about 10 years, you'd have naturally thought he would come back to Britain. But again, Britain thought the war was only going to be on for a few months. And they had quite a strict age criteria on who could join up. And 40 was the age cap for anyone in Britain to join up. So my great uncle was too old to join in Britain. And then suddenly France decided on something like the 3rd or the 4th of August that they would allow everybody to join the Foreign Legion. Unlike the normal Foreign Legion terms that were called for the duration of the war, they would be, would be 5 years. They said, you will join for the duration, because as the war was over by Christmas, they could get shot of everybody. So on the very day that the French Foreign Legion opened up recruitment to foreigners, my great uncle left his house down near the Eiffel Tower, walked into the central recruiting office in the Seine. I mean, this is ridiculous because he's nearly 41 years old. He's a car salesman. But I'm a former serviceman myself, and the army has a great way of putting round pegs in square holes. Now, rather unusually for my great uncle, they actually put a round peg in a round hole, because he spoke French fluently, and he spoke German fluently, and he also spoke Italian. And in those days, you have to remember, at the beginning of the First World War, both armies, and when the Americans joined in 1917, they were horse-mounted armies. They weren't motorized armies. The motor car had barely entered service into the army by then. So, of course, my great uncle was a very skilled car man. So he joined the Foreign Legion, and then within a couple of weeks he was in Bordeaux, which was where the French government moved to when they thought Paris might fall to the German advance. And then he was assigned to a very charismatic French commander, a chap called Henri Gourou, who had won a lot of medals and a lot of political acclaim by winning wars in the French colonies in North Africa. He arrived in Paris at the station, was lionized, and he was sent to the Argonne Forest with what was called the 10th Paris Division. He was his first command as a divisional commander. And in the second week of September, he arrived in the Argonne. And at this point, the campaign was ebbing and flowing all over the place. And lo and behold, assigned to him as his driver, translator, and general sort of factotum was my great uncle. I mean, you couldn't have imagined two more different characters. A man committed to service for the French government, being steeped in military history, and my great uncle, a car salesman.
Well,
so
you know,
from
go ahead. Yeah. I was going to say, Richard, that one of the you're telling the history of the fighting in the Argonne from 1914 to 1918, but one of the things that's truly enjoyable in your book are the letters, in fact, that you found in the shoebox and that you quote from liberally. And just one quote here, and you can respond to it. Bob writes, "War, when you are at home by a nice fire with your slippers on, smoking a big pipe, accompanied by a large whiskey and soda, reading the latest news, is not easy to realize to its fullest extent. It is more conclusively brought home when you have to sleep in the mud with cold feet and an empty stomach." So he's not only writing letters, he's writing very descriptive and interesting letters.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, I mean, America coming in the war slightly later on, is there was a free-for-all. Anybody could write anything between the sort of beginning of the war, August, and Christmas. And when you read the book, what you see is, I mean, in England, we call it Boy's Own. Boy's Own was a popular sort of comic that came out weekly, and it told ripping tales from the empire and lots of good chaps doing good jobs and sorting everybody out. And when you read my great uncle's letters, they start off on this very bullish sort of thing. We're here, we're going to knock the Bosch back, we'll be in Berlin in 2 weeks' time. And then obviously, as the campaign develops, it gets
changed
darker
tone.
and darker and darker. And of course, the correspondence stops slightly. It stops in January, February 1915, because certainly Britain and France had started very heavily censoring the news from the front, because the news from the front was increasingly not good news. It was, this war, being in Berlin by Christmas, etc., etc. Everyone realised by then the trenches ran all the way from Nieuwpoort in Belgium down to the Swiss border. People realised this was a long, hard slog then. So my uncle, I think, depicts this early optimism to the grim reality that this isn't jolly hockey sticks. This is a very hard, bitter struggle.
Well, actually, I want to kind of add, kind of play off on what you just said. Again, a lot of it Americans know about, or a vague notion of, that was our battle and we were there. But as you point out so well in your book, there's a struggle that goes on from 1914 to 1917, 1918, when the Americans do show up. So particularly for our American viewers, could you kind of just give us an overview of what the fighting is like in the Argonne and what's going on before we even get there?
So what one has to sort of go back slightly to is, the Germans and French have been spoiling for a fight for sort of 30, 40 years. They built up these huge armies on the back of conscription. Britain didn't have a very big army at all. It was rather like the American army when they joined the war in 1917, 250,000 regulars and 250,000 reservists, whereas Germany had this huge army of 2 million men. France had 2 million men. So the Germans, as by the plan, advanced across the border, and the forest had a lot of history. It served as quite a vital border defence between France and what was previously called the Holy Roman Empire. And neither side was particularly keen to engage in combat in the forest. So as the German 5th and 4th armies advanced, they swept down either side of the forest, and there's a couple of pictures which show the type of destruction. Now, what one has to imagine as well is this was the first time so this is a picture of a town called Clermont, taken just before, probably about 1910, 1912, beautiful little bucolic village. And then this was it by Christmas 1914, completely destroyed by artillery. I mean, the French obviously said that it was German artillery, but also the French were firing on the Germans there. Probably 70-30, probably most of the damage was caused by the Germans. So the Germans swept down either side of the forest, and the French army was involved in this massive retreat. And they got down to a place called Revigny, which is about another 30, 40 miles south of the Argonne Forest. And there, these great tectonic battles were the horns were really locked. And the German army attacked en masse across a wide front. But this we're talking now about middle of September. This massive German assault took place to the south, and the French somehow, I have nothing but great respect for the courage of the French soldier, as we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. Never underestimate the defender defending their country, and the tenacity of the French, despite this overwhelming firepower and superiority of the Germans, clung to the bitter death. But at this point, the German plan had been to be in Paris in 6 weeks, because the German plan was to knock France out of the war, and Germany's prime enemy was the Russians, because they had calculated by 1917 that the Russian army would be bigger and more powerful than the German army, and Germany wanted to see itself as the superior European land power. So the plan had started to go wrong. The casualties had been appalling. And it became quite clear by the middle of September that the big German advances couldn't be sustained. And to the heartbreak of the German soldiers who were at the front, on I think it's the night of the 12th, 13th of September, the order to retreat across the whole of the front is given. So suddenly the German army that's been on the front foot is moving back, and the British in the north, but primarily the French, because the French had far the biggest army, start chasing the Germans. And obviously this front sort of runs all the way from Switzerland up to Channel, but we're talking about the Argonne Forest. So again, the German army retreated either side of the forest, and they retreated to the northern end of the forest. And there's some ambiguity about what the order was here, because if you know the history of the Western Front, the history of the Western Front is about the minimum amount of men you need to defend the front. Now, one of the problems that the German army had was this front was absolutely vast. So anywhere that you could save an area of frontage in order to save manpower became crucial. So in the sort of, as is described as the fog of war. Now, in the fog of war, the German line was supposed to have been at the southern end of the forest between Clermont and a town called Saint-Menieu. But the chap, Crown Prince Wilhelm, who was in charge of the Fifth Army, he thought that front would take too many men. So he thought they would have better land to the north where they could sit on the high ground that the French wouldn't be able to take. So the battle swept back up to the north of the forest. And this is the point at which my great uncle arrived. And in his letters, he talks about how the front moves backwards and forwards. Now, the French, not unsurprisingly, given that they brought in some foresters and some hunters, the French moved into the forest because nobody was in the forest at this point. And what the French did is sort of almost last of the Mohicans Vietnam type war, is that the French went into the forest, moved through the forest, and were ambushing the Germans because the German army tactics were to fight out in the open in a sort of designated company battalion order. So the French were quite happily sitting in the forest, sniping at them, setting up ambushes, luring the Germans into the forest and ambushing them. And there's some quite graphic descriptions of how awful it was for the Germans. But this front, the width of the forest represented something like 8 to 10 kilometers of front. And with the trenches being dug either side, both sides sort of soon came to the position that they would have to start digging across the front. So sometimes not on always the best ground, each side started digging. Now, because these armies were geared up for open battles, the nature of the Argonne Forest is it's called gaze. It's a porous rock. Now, the scenes that most people will know of the First World War is these trenches in mud. Well, the Argonne was exactly the opposite. The Argonne sort of soil was virtually impervious because of this gaze rock. So what happened as each army fanned out across the forest to try and build a front line, they couldn't, in fact, dig in because the ground was more or less impervious. So what they did is they built up sort of barricades across the front. And then as each side got better organised, around about November, December, lots better tools started to arrive. They started to be able to use dynamite and explosives to blow down. So probably round about the middle to the end of November, the actual front line had solidified in a trench system. It wasn't perfect. It went up and down and in and out and backwards and forwards and was very, very labour intensive. And it became apparent that when the weather improved, because the weather in the Argonne Forest was simply appalling in the winter, one of the biggest casualties, 1914-15, was just these makeshift trenches collapsing on the men inside them and in the shelters and burying them alive. So it became apparent to Guru, the commander of the French army, and Wilhelm on the other side, that what they would need to do in the spring, each side would need to launch an offensive to get a better position to try and cut down the amount of men, because both sides had something like 100,000 men across the forest, and neither army could sustain this.
Richard, so I'm going to jump in. Yeah. I'm going to jump in just to say that all of what you've just described, that's the first 3 months of the story, which gives you an idea, I think, of kind of, and I know of what goes on here over the years, and I know that there's some stabilization of the line, but there's a lot of attacks back and forth of different types, and one of the people, because I want to make sure we get to this. One of the people who's there involved in some of the attacks going on is wrong picture. Is a young German lieutenant named Erwin Rommel, who goes on to some fame of some sort or another later on in World War II, the Desert Fox. So when does he come in, and what part of this is he involved in? How does that impact him?
Well, he was in the vanguard. He was in a regiment called the Württembergs. They crossed over the border. He was in some early skirmishes as they crossed the border. But his first big battle, which was fixing bayonets, fighting people hand to hand, was down at Revigny. He was then injured in a very early sort of scrape in the forest in September, October. And he was so badly injured. And in this scrape, he saw some French running through the forest. So he ran after them and he was a bayonet champion before the war, and he felt that if he got close to the French, he could engage them in bayonet combat. Well, the French shot him in the leg, and he tumbled over, and he was very badly shot in the leg. So he then went back to Germany. So this brings us to 1915. Each side's galvanizing itself for the spring and the possible offensive. So Rommel arrives back, and of course, the sort of to and fro guerrilla warfare he'd experienced is now this what became known all the way along the Western Front as positional warfare. So he arrived back to find his regiment, dug in, going, and a sort of tour of duty in those days was he spent roughly a week to 10 days on the front. You then went back to the rear where your uniform was taken off, it was cleaned, you got proper food, you got proper rest, and you probably had 5 or 6 days rest, and then you moved up to the support trenches, and their job was to bring the ammo forward, take the casualties back, act as reinforcement if there were breaches on the front line. And this also enabled the men to get attuned to their turn at the front. So this roster was going on. So Rommel joined in the roster. So what happened was, and this is where Rommel came into his own, is the chap who took over so Wilhelm was in charge of the German Fifth Army, which ran from the western side of the Argonne Forest over to Verdun, and a chap called Mudra took over the German army in the forest, and he was an engineer. And what he had learnt was that great frontal attacks were unlikely to be successful, and what he wanted to trade on was these very keen, dynamic corporals and sergeants. Now, Germany, like all the armies did at the time, had this very hierarchical command, people met in chateaus and designated out plans. Well, what Mudra decided was that the generals could designate the plan, but actually how the plan would be carried out would be left to these corporals and captains and lieutenants. And he started to say to them, if you wake up one morning and the French have gone to sleep and you think you could go over there without artillery support, with that, you go and do it. And all the way through January and February, these very brave Germans were sort of suddenly leading these attacks, and they were securing great success, which played into Mudra's hand. And Rommel was one of these brave, dashing commanders who spotted an opportunity, jumped over. So we now move to the spring. Now, what was agreed is that there would be a big offensive in the spring to try and straighten the line, get rid of the need for so much manpower. And they'd agreed they'd give him heavy artillery, they'd give him whatever he needed. Well, of course, in the spring, this is when the British and the French decided that they needed to start the offensive in the north. So the campaign for May was called off, and all the artillery and the ammunition was shipped up to the north to block the attacks of the British and the French up to the north. So everybody in the forest is sitting there biding their time. Eventually, because of the casualties, the British and the French attacks peter out in the north. The lines solidified. So the artillery and the ammunition, etc., come back down to the forest. And then in early July, Germany launched this assault on the French, the likes of which no one had seen anywhere before. And it featured things that were to become totemic in the First World War. Now, the Hague Convention decreed that you couldn't use noxious gas. Now, each side everyone blames everyone for using gas, but what the Germans did is in 1915, they recruited an incredible physicist, because what they couldn't do was get gas in a shell. Now, this physicist worked away in a lab and devised a way to get gas into a shell. So the first sort of secret weapon the Germans had was the gas in the shell. The second weapon they had was a flamethrower. They developed this flamethrower because they decided that, there was no point in trying to fight blokes down trenches, fire these flamethrowers down the trenches. And the third thing was these very shock assaults done by young, brave men who would punch through holes, and they wouldn't worry about rounding up prisoners and clearing trenches. Their thing was just to roll on through and allow the troops come in behind. So I think it's about the middle of July 1915, this massive German assault opens up all the way along the line, and the courage of the French. I mean, you imagine, you haven't got a gas mask, you've never seen a flamethrower, you're vaguely aware of these sort of, because these men later on became famous as stormtroopers, but they weren't called stormtroopers then. This assault just took off all over the front. The French literally fought in many cases, they fought to the last man. And during a 6-week campaign, they managed to take on average, about 1,500 meters of front. Nobody had ever taken that much before. And it was in these very bitter battles that required huge courage and endeavor that Rommel stepped forward on numerous occasions, leading trench raids, retaking positions, and in one of these attacks, he earned his second Iron Cross. So by the autumn of 1915, the French had retreated into very unfavourable ground, but the Germans now held the high ground all the way across the forest. They were able, as it were, instead of the front line being 15 kilometres long, it was 10 kilometres long, which meant you didn't need so many men. You weren't overlooked. And one of the things that had been developed during 1914-15 was this mining. Because of this soil underneath, this gaze soil, you were able to mine, and you didn't need the amount of sort of props and supports that you see in the films in the north where they mine, because they were digging through chalk, digging through mud that required support. So they were able to tunnel through this gaze. And this became also known as the War of Mines. They dug underneath each other and blew each other to pieces. And when they'd blown a line, they advanced through. Autumn of 1915, the line is consolidated and everybody gets ready for the harsh winter, assuming that in 1916, one side or the other will launch another attack to take more ground or to retake the lost ground. So we end 1915, both sides out across the forest, huge casualties, something like 50, 60,000 on each side, and each side waiting for the spring of 1916 to go again.
So, Richard, is there something that's kind of unique or particular to the fighting in the Meuse Argonne that you don't see in other parts of the Western Front? Is it something that sets it apart from what we usually picture is going on?
Not. I mean, what set it apart early on was the sort of Vietnam type guerrilla warfare in the forest, which nobody else had, because there were no other sort of. There was a slightly different fighting again further south towards the Swiss border, but. So I'd say initially in the first part of the war, which went for about 6 weeks, was this fighting in and out of the forest, ambushing, luring people in, which didn't happen on other sections of front. The War of the Mines was different because nobody else could mine. I mean, as the war developed further to the north, mining techniques improved, and both the French and the Germans and the British spent the whole war tunnelling under each other. And of course, in 1915 was this awful assault. And the German Fifth Army acquired a lot of kudos from this, because on the northern sector, which was the biggest sector against the French and the British, Germany, for all this huge loss of life, had nothing to show for it. But actually using these tactics of gas, flamethrowers and stormtroops, they had taken 1,200, 1,500, in some places 2,000 meters of penetration. This was unimaginable in the Western Front. And some of the other interesting developments that started then, of course, this was the beginning of aerial observation, because each side started to fly aeroplanes, as they could see over the other side. They had balloons. In the early days, the communication was obviously not as good as they developed later on in the war. So all sorts of things that became standard practice later on entered into the sort of lexicon of army jargon, which was balloons went up. They were able to observe where artillery was firing. They were able to drop shells down more accurately. Fighter aircraft were able to sort of obviously see large movements of formations to and from the front. And of course, during the summer of 1915, because something like 80% of French casualties were people getting pieces of shrapnel landing on their head, and tin helmets were invented almost simultaneously by the French, the Germans and the British. And also the French at the beginning of the war fought in blue jackets and red trousers, which made them incredibly conspicuous. So as the war developed in 1915, what we today would call camouflage started to appear in uniforms as well. So, one of the biggest developments was actually grenades, because grenades didn't exist as we know them. And of course, because everything was so wet and damp, the grenades they made were absolutely rubbish. They sort of fell into a puddle and went splat. So the engineers in France and Germany, worked overtime to develop, grenades, because grenades became key to jumping into trenches.
Well, one of the first groups of Americans to come to the Argonne, even before American soldiers, Pershing comes to France, and it is proclaimed that Lafayette were here. But even before that, one of the first groups of Americans serving in France and in the Argonne is the American Ambulance Field Service. And you talk a little bit about these guys, because they do have a place of honor in your book. You do mention them quite a bit. Give us a sense of what they're about and why you wanted to include them.
Well, I mean, there's always been these very strong links between France and America going back to the War of Independence. And then during the 1870-71 war, there was an American hospital in Paris, and they sort of took themselves a role to look after casualties from the French army, but also if German casualties got brought in. And what they brought, they set up huge tented camps all over the centre of Paris. And what they brought with them was what the Americans had learned in the American Civil War about controlling infection, etc., etc. So America had this very strong foundation in Paris in 1914, which was the American hospital. And when the war started, America's position obviously was they were non-combatants, but it didn't take out the fact they couldn't help injured people. So the American hospital in Paris, in fact, moved site and expanded considerably. But obviously what the French weren't able to do, because they were busy at the front, was to bring the casualties to the hospital. So a sort of quite a wonderful collection of Americans who were either resident in Paris or arrived in France volunteered themselves up to set up ambulance services. And here we see the great, the classic AFS ambulance. So they sort of struggled along, but of course they had all these young men who were all sort of, out of college and were looking, they knew they couldn't be involved in the war, but they wanted to do something more dangerous. Well, Woodrow Wilson wasn't sort of having any of them getting involved in it, and their orders were very strict not to be involved in it. So they did, and it became known as jitney work. And the jitney work was they went to one hospital and transferred patients to another. And then as the French army obviously began to feel the strain, the American Ambulance Service said, well, what if we actually started to move men from the front to the hospitals rather than from a rear hospital to another rear hospital? So they were given a trial down south of the Argonne in a quieter sector with this Model T vehicle. Now, I mean, one of the sort of stories of this is, Henry Ford didn't even sell them these vehicles at a discount. They had to pay the full price to ship them over. Unbelievable.
That is just the most believable thing you've said so far.
Yeah. So they brought these things over, and they had these huge fundraising rallies in America. Lots of college boys signed up for it. You signed up for 6 months, and the only thing you were given was French pay. You even had to pay for your uniform and pay to travel across the Atlantic. So it made it slightly exclusive. A country boy farmer or someone like that wasn't able to go to America and drive an ambulance. You probably had to be a college boy. You had to have a family with money. And so this cycle of people started. They started on the work down south of the Argonne Forest. And then it sort of brings us back to the nature of the offensive. So in the spring of 1916, it was anticipated that either the French would attack the Germans to regain the lost ground, or the Germans would attack the French. Well, what happened was, out of the blue, the chap called Falkenhayn, who had now taken over command of the German army, dreamt up a completely bonkers strategy. He was now going to attack Verdun. And historians 100 years later dispute as to why there's stories that he wanted to bleed the French army to death, well, whatever. So in February 1916, they attacked Verdun with, the stories are 1 million rounds were fired in the first few days, but it was one of the first really barbaric assaults of the First World War. Well, of course, into this maelstrom came the American Ambulance Service, because by now it was all hands to the deck, whatever it takes to get this thing fixed. Now, Verdun was surrounded on 3 sides. So you had the Fifth Army. So instead of them fighting in the forest, they switched their campaign to the east, and everybody joined in on this huge fight round Verdun. Now, what was quite clever with the French was they realised that, Verdun, if they'd have lost Verdun, it wouldn't have been in the end of the world. But what they saw it was as a quite an important battle. And the decision was made very early on that all French troops would be engaged in the defence of Verdun. Now, they couldn't get them all up to the front because the Germans had sabotaged or blown to pieces the railway line that ran south of the Argonne Forest. So this incredible route from Bar-le-Duc, it's now called the Sacred Way. They set up the Sacred Way, and the troops came up. the troops that survived went back, and the American ambulance. This is where they won their spurs. Was in the Verdun campaign. They came up and down, bringing the casualties because the French didn't have the suspension on the vehicles. They had 7 or 8. I mean, one of the things the American ambulance service learnt was we only want one type of vehicle, because if it gets damaged, becomes unusable, what we can do is cannibalize it and stick the parts on another one. And they could literally, if they turned over, which they did quite regularly on the sacred route, they could just go and get a group of French soldiers and stick it back up on the track again. So really, for the American ambulance service, their worth was proved, and they won their spurs on the Verdun offensive. And then, of course, once their worth to the French was provided, they then did start to work up in the Argonne sector, because although the war was being fought at Verdun, there were still attacks and minings going on in the Argonne sector, and also they went up to the Champagne sector. But then further north, there was another American ambulance service tended to be up there. But the big thing was the American Field Ambulance Service, and I am a great admirer of them and the service that they did to France. And it is not just anecdote. I think it's fact that the French, when they saw an American ambulance, they thought they might live. Whereas when they saw a French one, they didn't have that conviction that they might live, because the journey was so torturous with no suspension.
So Richard, so eventually, of course, America does enter the fight, and they get an army to France, and there's a whole long story about the fight to keep an intact American army and whatnot, and you get into that in the book. But what I mean, just like for basics, along the whole Western Front, how is it that the Americans wind up in the Meuse Argonne? What brings this army to that spot as opposed to anywhere else along the Western?
Well, I mean, we sort of go back to the American involvement in the war. Wilson got re-elected in 1916, and his ticket was, I won't be sending your sons to fight in France. We're going to remain neutral. We're not going to get involved. And then the British intercepted a telegram between the German Minister of Defence, a chap called Zimmermann, and his counterpart in Mexico, in which it stated that Germany would assist Mexico in a border war in America. Well, of course, this was red rag to a bull, and America couldn't sort of sit back and say that. And there was a lot of toing and froing, because for a long time the Germans denied this telegram had ever been made, and they said it was British Secret Service mischief making. But finally, round about March, the Germans conceded they had sent this message to the Mexicans. So in I think it's April the 6th, April the 8th, America declared war and sort of said, right, we're going to come over to Europe. I mean, some of the cynics would say, because Britain and France could not bankroll the war was bankrolled by Wall Street. And I think if you're cynical, there was a lot of concern in Wall Street that the Germans might win the war and America would lose billions. And I mean, it might effectively bankrupt America if they lost the war. So some more cynical people would say, yes, the Zimmermann telegram was helpful, but actually it was Wall Street who said, unless we get out there, the country might go bankrupt.
Are any of those cynical people on this particular Zoom today? Maybe one at least, maybe a couple. Okay.
So what happens is that the American army is as badly prepared as the British army is. It's 150,000 people down on the Mexican border with Pershing in command. Fortuitously, he has, for a man who was one of the last in his class at West Point, he was never marked down as a great success, but he was involved in the last campaign on the Wild West. He was involved in the campaign in Cuba. He got a reputation as quite a solid field commander. He didn't have the political connections, but what he did do is he married Secretary of State Baker's daughter. And of course, that enabled him to catch people's eye in Washington. So he was down on the Mexican border, and he was just recovering from the awful news that his wife and his 3 daughters had been killed in a fire at their house. And he was absolutely distraught. And he was summoned to Washington. And what he assumed was he was nowhere near the top of the pecking order to take command of the American Expeditionary Forces. So he was summoned to Washington. He hoped for a modest command, perhaps a division or something. And he got summoned, and he saw Baker, happened to be his father-in-law. And Baker said, they're going to put you in charge. And he went in to see Wilson. And according to the records, a very obtuse conversation took place because Wilson hadn't sort of set out what the American war aims were. Basically, he said, get some men, get out there and see what's going on and tell us. So he crossed over on the White Star. And I mean, it's sort of quite a sad and strange and wonderful sort of First World War story. So he crossed over on I think it's the White Star. And there was a marching band and a regiment of infantry. They landed in Liverpool, where, of course, the British, everybody thought at last saviours are coming to sort of, because by then, Britain and France, the casualties are unbelievable. We are seriously starting to run out of men. So, of course, they imagine the Americans are going to turn up with these huge armies. So Pershing arrives in Liverpool, and one of the first things he receives is quite an aggressive grilling from the British press. So he sends back to America that he's not going to have that happen with his army, and any press that come with the American army are going to have quite a tight muzzle on them, because he's not going to be interrogated like the British press want to interrogate him. So he comes down to London, he meets the King, he meets Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and he meets the British Field Commander, General Haig. So these very early valuable friendships for the war are starting to be formed. But of course, when he goes to Aldershot to see some training, and of course he sees, because my grandfather, he was 5'2", myopic, downgraded, never to go to the front. But because we ran out of men, people like my grandfather suddenly started to meet the criteria. And he is quite shocked when he sees the British Army training, because there's such poor physical specimens. But of course, he then starts to realise actually how serious this war is. So he crosses over to France. And in the spring of 1917, the French army had a hideous failure of a campaign just near the Argonne Forest at a place called Le Chemin de Dam. And literally tens of thousands of Frenchmen have been slaughtered. And the French army effectively went on strike and mutinied. So actually, the arrival of the Americans was quite a relief to the French, because what they said is, well, we'll have a rest and we'll wait for the American army to come. So Pershing arrives in Paris. And of course, there's endless parades, endless ceremonies. He goes to Lafayette's tomb, all this sort of good stuff. And Pershing, though, he's quite hardcore. He doesn't like the bright lights of Paris. He doesn't like the constant partying. And he goes to Chaumont, which was the glove centre for France. And he begins to set up on paper what his army is. Well, of course, the French, not quite so much the British, but the French had naturally assumed that a country as big as America had a vast army waiting to come over. So when they found it was a marching regiment and a band, they were not a little bit disappointed. But of course, Pershing's original sort of scheme was for an American army of 250,000 or so. Well, he then realised that it needed to be 500,000. So he sent orders back to America. The army we're talking about isn't anywhere big enough at all. We're going to need 500,000, and 500,000 became 1 million. So, of course, this very strange situation developed along the front, where this great, powerful army had arrived. Pershing wasn't particularly worried about where he fought. He just wanted somewhere where the American army could stand on its own. But he had a structural problem. Was he brought over with him, what I love about America, he brought over these incredible engineers, planners, people, and he sent them on a recce all the way around France and Italy, because Britain had hegemony over the Channel ports and France had hegemony over everything else. So if you're going to have this grand army come to France, essentially on your own. So what his people did is they identified 5 ports on the west coast of France. And one of my, the ambulance service are some of my heroes, but my real heroes of the book is the service and supply. This is a unit that sort of started out from scratch, primarily African Americans, because America had to bring everything over on ship, flat packed. They brought trains, they brought railway lines, they brought their accommodation, they brought everything flat packed from America. And then when it was flat packed out of the boxes in the harbours, they then built the railway line to the Western Front, because the French had no railway capacity for them. It is just simply incredible. But this did take quite a long time. And the situation was very complicated, because the Americans had to doff their caps to the British, because the British brought them across the Atlantic, which of course Pershing didn't like, because so the British thought, well, we bring the Americans over the Atlantic, they'll be under our command. So these very complicated political games were going on. And by this time, Wilson had become quite concerned that the Americans might be subsumed into the British or the French army. So he gave a lot more explicit instructions to Pershing, which is, I don't care where it is, it can be in Belgium, it can be in Switzerland, you get a sector of the front, you put our army in there. And in 1917, because the Russians sued for peace in the spring of 1917, and they had been planning then to bring over 500,000 men from the Eastern Front, because bear in mind, Germany were fighting on the Western Front and on the Eastern Front. They were going to bring over 500,000 men because they had their spies in the ports in America. They had their spies in the ports on the West Coast. They were counting literally man for man how many Americans were arriving. And it didn't take them long to realize, unless they pretty quickly knocked the British and the French out of the war, making the Americans' position untenable, that America would just numerically overwhelm everybody. So in I think it was March the 26th, 1918, the Germans launched this massive offensive all along the front, ironically not round Verdun and Argonne, primarily on the northern French and the British sectors. And the French and the British army were completely knocked for six. Now, of course, this played into the, at this point, Pétain, the hero of Verdun, is in charge of the French army, Haig is in charge of the British army, and Foch is what was called the Generalissimo. So he was notionally in charge of the French, the British, and the American army. And this played into the French and the British hands because Pershing was forced to surrender his troops to the British and the French to block this massive American offence. So the American troops...
The massive German.
Massive German offence. So, of course, the American troops were channeled into the British and the French armies, and, you know, the Americans fought somewhat bravely and somewhat dangerously because Pershing said, you've got to get out there in the open and fight them with bayonets. But, you know, the Americans hadn't witnessed the power of the German machine guns and the artillery. And obviously Beyer Wood, Buller Wood, the American Marine Corps, some of these are the totemic battles that were fought. Well, as the German offensive sort of ran out of steam, the British and the Americans quite gleefully rubbed their hands and said, they're under our command now, this is the way we'll go forward, because it was becoming apparent now that Germany had shot their bolt, their casualties were simply eye-watering, the gains they had, the same as 1914, were unsustainable, and everybody was quite happy with the plan except for Pershing, because Pershing was itching. So the first plan presented by Foch was that they would support a French push down in the Lorraine area over towards Metz. Metz was a big regional railway hub, and the French army would attack with American support. Now, Pershing it was better than nothing, but he wasn't particularly happy because it involved America having a support role. But then there was this awful battle. I think it was the Keystone Division in a place called Fismet by Champagne. And the American Keystone had been subsumed into a French division. And they were ordered to defend this town called Fismety. And in Fismety, hundreds and hundreds of Frenchmen had been killed. Basically, it was a small town with a river at the back and a horseshoe of hills round it. And anyone who was just in the bottom was subject to artillery attacks, gas attacks. And the French general ordered a company from the Keystone to cross over and defend it. And the American commanders were outraged. They said, this is suicide. And in the gesture of the big generals that are famous in these anti-war films, the French general said, well, when you've been in the war as long as us, you'll know a company of men is nothing. And of course, the American commanders were forced to send the men across the river, and the Germans couldn't believe their luck, woke up in the morning, found all the Americans in the village, and they just decimated them. And the first thing they did was they blew up the bridge so the Americans couldn't cross back over the bridge. And I think it was a big company, about 350 men, and I think about 10 men survived. Well, when Pershing heard this, he was absolutely incandescent, and he said, never, never again will a French or a German officer kill my men. My men will be commanded by my officers, and we will give those orders. So Foch and Pershing have another hideous spat, which ends up with Pershing storming off. Meanwhile, people are talking that this big offensive is going to start in August to push the Germans back. Now, Pétain got on quite well with Pershing, and what he brokered was a new deal that, first of all, the Americans would have their first real big battle down on what was called the Bulge, which was just south of Verdun. It had been a bulge in the French line since 1914. So the Americans would go there and cut their teeth. But then what Pétain offered Pershing was, we will give you a sector from the west side of the Argonne Forest to Verdun, and you will push north. Well, Pershing didn't care. He was just, at last, I have a sector at the front. But in order to deceive the Germans, so what was created was the first American army, and the first American army would deploy from the west side of the Argonne Forest over to the Meuse River. But the slight problem was the American army, meanwhile, had been built up down to the south to attack Metz. So the French, as a sort of throwaway thing, said, well, you get your army up to here, we'll give you the transport. So luckily for the Americans, now, meanwhile, Pershing, he just wanted the front. And when this plan was agreed, they'd take over the Meuse Argonne sector, he threw it out to the staff officers, and it very famously landed with a quite clever lieutenant colonel, a certain Bill Marshall.
George Marshall.
George Marshall, yeah. So so he's got the plan. So Marshall went away at night and wrote 2 sides of A4, and he thought Pershing will never swallow this. And he went in to see Pershing, and I mean, the simplest plans are the best plans. So Pershing looked at the plan and said, "Go and do it, George. Go and make it happen." And off he went. And with the French providing the transport, because they had to move the American army secretly, it had to be moved at night, so the Germans couldn't see that the American thrust was switching from the east to the north. So overnight, over 3 weeks, 1.5 million men were shipped secretly into the southern end of the forest. They were hidden in their entirety. They were hidden in villages. And on the night of the 26th, the only Americans who were allowed to the front line were French Americans who spoke fluent French, who were dressed in French uniforms, carried no American identity at all. They moved up to the front lines, and it is an incredible story. So on the night of the 26th, the French moved out of the front line and then across the whole 20-kilometre sector of the Meuse Argonne front, which was the 77th Division, took the Argonne Forest, and then the Keystone and all the rest fanned out across. A logistic miracle, and, credit to Marshall for this incredible plan. So we then arrive. It's the morning of the 26th of September.
Richard, I have to jump in. We're running low on time here. We're approaching the end of the war isn't nigh, but the end of the show is. And Chris, I wanted to give you a chance here, maybe to. I think we probably have time for one more question, and I thought maybe you wanted to give us that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you have an intimate knowledge of. And I'd like you to expand on this. What is kind of living in the Meuse Argonne and studying it so intently on the ground? What's that done for your understanding of the event, and how do you think that improves, sort of your knowledge of this terrain and this fight and this moment?
Well, I'm an ex-soldier myself. What I've learned from being there is this incredible courage of the ordinary soldier, be they French, German, Italian, or American. The conditions were appalling. Death was a pretty good certainty. The weapons were barbaric. The American Civil War was obviously the largest American casualties, but the decimation caused by the artillery, and also, what's quite interesting is the First World War actually brought most of the weapons that are established as the weapons of modern warfare, which was the First World War brought the tank, the horse was replaced by the tank. Aeroplanes became accepted as support, mechanized transport for bringing troops forwards and backwards. In the Atlantic Ocean, it was submarines. So a lot of the things that were very finely developed for the Second World War owe their provenance. And of course, one of the great American commanders was Patton, who was a tank commander in the Meuse Argonne offensive. So what you really saw was this warfare that became fine-tuned for the Second World War. War was pioneered there. I salute the courage of everybody who took part in the campaign and the awful deprivations that they suffered. And I think it was this. How did people who a few short weeks ago had been leading a relatively normal life, one of the quotes I use in the book is, as the French soldiers come up through the forest, they enter Hell's Gate. And you just imagine these poor recruits. I mean, admittedly, most of the Americans were conscripts, although a lot of them were volunteers. Is you get sucked into this dark vortex, and it is hell on earth. The Germans are in front of you, behind you, on top of you, and the courage of the American soldiers. Because you have to bear in mind, one of the reasons that they said the Americans were given this sector was that for 3 years, the French hadn't managed to move it an inch, not an inch of that front line moved. So in a way, they threw Pershing the poison chalice as if to say, well, we haven't gained an inch here. You see what you can do with it. And the planning, the courage of the 77th Division, who, went over the top on the morning of the 26th and fought their way 3 solid weeks up through the forest. And the legendary story of Whittlesey getting out in front of the Americans, finding himself cut off, and how they hung on in there for 8 days is one of the great stories, and one of the stories I like telling. The Lost Battalion, I love telling that story. And of course, there's a direct consequence of the Americans trying to relieve the pressure on the Lost Battalion is the 82nd are deployed at Chateau Chéry, and Sergeant York writes himself into the American history books by wriggling through the line, fighting the Germans and capturing, I think it's 132 men. So some of the great American history stories are written there. And in the book, when Whittlesey dies after the war, there's a wonderful quote in the book about the sacrifice the Americans made. And although, we may be gone, the land will bear the scars of the American sacrifice in the Argonne Forest.
We lost you a little bit there, but I think the quote in the 77th Division history is, if the trees on this torn slope of France could break the silence, they would say, by these splintered wounds you see upon us, we live to mark the valor of the Americans. Yeah. Richard Merry, thank you so much for joining us today. We could have done 2 hours, but sadly we don't have the 2 hours. But this and a lot more, including the Italians.
Read the book.
What the Italians were doing there, the Garibaldis, also part of the story. Yeah. The Great War in the Argonne Forest by Richard Merry. Lots of interesting stuff in there. Richard, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Good luck with everything.
Wow. We'll have to come back to the Lost Battalion another time, which is a great story. And you and you've been that spot, I'm sure, many times. You took me there. 7 Medals of Honor awarded, as Richard points out in his book, for the Lost Battalion. Also, the 92nd Division, African American Division, involved in the Argonne. Yeah, it's Freddie Stowers and his Medal of Honor that we stood by his graveside there in the rain in 2018. Is it that long ago? Is it 4 years ago?
It is.
Oh my gosh,
that long ago.
Everybody, if you liked what you saw today, and why wouldn't you? Would you please like us if you're on Facebook, or subscribe if you are on YouTube? We are, sort of desperate for your approval. And it just takes a second, but it does really help. And Chris, a big thank you to the growing list of folks supporting us on Patreon. And this week we're back to just doing our top shelf sponsors. Look, we evened that number out because we got another top shelf sponsor. But there is more room. We can make more room on the top shelf page. If you want to help keep the history tabs open by joining us at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. We have some nice extra material there for you to look at if you're a devotee of the History Happy Hour approach to history. And Chris, next week, pretty interesting show. I think we're going to do something different. We're going to take a look at current events through the lens of World War II. So the war in the Ukraine has brought many suggestions of parallels with World War II. And so we are going to invite on a couple of previous guests, Sean McMeekin, the author of Stalin's War, and David Murphy, the author of The Winter War. A couple of historians, and who knows, maybe we'll find somebody else to join them as well. And we're going to sort of take a look at those historical parallels and what we can learn from them. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. Bush, I'm running out of things to say. Am I missing anything?
Well, yeah, I think that's it.
All right.
Be safe, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
See you next week.